Plato famously held that the ideal statesman ought to be the philosopher. The best state will assign the sovereign authority, in other words, on the basis of philosophical accomplishment. The most accomplished philosopher is at the same time the best qualified to rule. This doesn't imply that every low-level bureaucrat needs to read Plato, but it does imply that the authentic statesman, the true lawgiver, needs to use philosophical reasoning if he is to do his job scientifically. Now, coming from a philosopher, that might sound a bit biased, but it is the definition of the statesman that he identifies the common good and guides the community towards it. In order to identify the common good, you have to engage in ethical contemplation. There is no alternative. Ethics is a branch of philosophy. Ergo, in order to know the common good, you have to engage in philosophical reasoning. So, the person who's best equipped to identify the common good will be the philosopher. Who else? You could say the prophet or someone relying on revelation, and perhaps that's the case, but human beings can't validate revelation except by cross-referencing it with our own reasoning faculties. The method by which a human can understand the nature of the common good is philosophy. Now, if God hands down some axiology, some system of values, well, God is wiser than us, and that is something superior to philosophy. But among human beings, the way we understand the common good is the tools of philosophy. And in order to move towards the common good, we have to identify the various roles within society and how they appropriately weave together. The various sciences and arts cannot define themselves. We can't understand what physics is through the tools of physics. We don't know what math is through the tools of mathematics exclusively. No amount of addition and subtraction can get you to a definition of math. And it can't get you to the usefulness of math. Math can't tell you how math ought to be used. Physics can't tell you how physics ought to be used. The same applies to visual art, crafts like pottery, engineering. To know what the engineer should be doing to benefit society, we have to know the nature of engineering, which requires the philosophical dialectic, the methods of division, dividing up nature at its joints, not cutting through bones like a bad butcher, but identifying the true kinds in nature. It requires analysis, inductive synthesis. It requires identifying the genus of the thing, identifying its differentiae, the distinguishing features that set that species apart from other species in the same genus. This philosophical dialectic is necessary to arrive at good, useful, true definitions of the arts, of the various roles in society. So who else is equipped to guide society towards the common good? What other science could possibly claim to have an advantage on philosophy in that respect? It has to be the philosopher in the ideal state that rules. Now, we don't live in an ideal state, and we don't necessarily have the best of philosophers among us. And if you're, for example, in an island scenario, 12 people crash land on an island and there are no philosophers, but one guy is like especially charismatic and he has good intuitions, then probably you should follow that one guy. But yeah, that's not the ideal state. And the world that we're living in, with the kind of existential crisis we are experiencing in light of rapid, unpredictable technological advance, necessitates conscious reformulation of political principles at a very fundamental level. As technology changes, society's ethics have to change to adapt to it. Many of the culture war issues that we're dealing with today were unthinkable 50 years ago because the technologies on which they're based didn't exist. You couldn't give someone hormone therapy and gender reassignment surgery in a convincing way, at least. And, you did not have easily available free pornography that children could access on their phones. Addiction to social media was irrelevant a half century ago because social media did not exist. So as technologies change, we have to adapt our moral framework. That requires continual philosophical work. And specialists in other disciplines often feel like they are equipped to handle these challenges. Technology experts feel that they are the qualified party to deal with the social media addiction problem or the hyperpolarization that happens as a result of these kind of siloed echo chamber cultures that crop up, where people fall into like continual confirmation bias and tend to only listen to stuff that they agree with. And then you have these factions in society that are speaking totally different languages. Like, a degree in computer science does not mean that you are more equipped to handle that societal issue than, a genuine philosopher. This is a common problem today. Experts in one specialized domain think that their expertise justifies them in a very broad social commentary. Because someone is a scientist, they should just be trusted across the board, even in matters of ethics, which is ridiculous, The problem is that everyone engages in philosophical reasoning. Everyone has a philosophy. It's impossible not to have a philosophy. But a lot of people don't recognize that they're engaged in philosophical reasoning. So that's a real problem. Most people do not read Plato, even though Plato is the foundation of the Western philosophical tradition. The Western philosophical tradition is the foundation of logic and higher mathematical reasoning and all of the sciences. So the modern world is, in a very literal sense, built on the work that Plato did, and before him, Pythagoras and others, and after him, Aristotle, etc. But people don't read that kind of foundational material that is really necessary if you want to understand the history of the development of Western thought. And yet, without doing this reading, without understanding how we've got here, people feel entitled to like broad-ranging social criticism, ethical pronouncements, forms of philosophical reasoning that are simply unself-reflective. Many people have like a great man theory of history. They think some people are just set apart. There is a natural kind of organic biological ruling caste. There's not much that can be done to change a person's fittedness to rule. But that's an unquantifiable something that someone is supposed to have that means they will identify the common good and be able to steer society towards it. Why exactly? If they're not engaged in philosophical reasoning. Now, if that great man theory is wedded to a theory that specifies that greatness, true greatness, is measured in wisdom, then sure, there are these great men that crop up that are kind of fitted to rule naturally, but then that's the same as Plato's theory. But at the same time, we should have institutions to facilitate the cultivation of philosophy because it doesn't just happen automatically. You require nature and training to excel in anything. Nothing is purely up to inheritance. There's also development and environmental factors that play in. Biological determinism is kind of just stupid anyway, because if it's right, like, there's nothing you can do to change the situation. What's going to happen is going to happen. So why even bother? Also, the people who argue for biological determinism in IQ and things like that, at the same time, justify their conclusions on the basis of complex sciences that require years of training, environmental exposure to assimilate into one's cognitive toolkit. So it's sort of self-contradictory if you think about it. But in any case, we today especially need the tools of philosophy in order to adapt to the changing technological circumstance. First and foremost, to fix this growing problem with AI. We have increased machine intelligence in the sense of the ability to solve problems. Right? That's one basic definition of intelligence. We set a problem for AI, and it's able to solve it through various techniques. The new large language model paradigm kind of unifies various techniques within artificial intelligence and models like all sorts of different systems as forms of language. And then it uses the techniques of prediction of sequences of words effectively in a broad domain or broad set of domains. And that's why it can do all this crazy stuff based on fundamentally one kind of statistical procedure. And what that amounts to is a huge amount of problem-solving ability, but no real direction inherently built into it. The AIs will lie to us, they will hallucinate, however that happens. I don't know if anyone fully understands how the hallucinations happen. AI is not fully understood. It is a black box. There are emergent behaviors that are coming out of it that no one programmed into it. So this thing is simply evolving. And its immediate goals, it kind of comes up with in order to solve the goal that it has overall been given. AI can't really set its own goals in absolute terms, but in order to reach some end goal, these systems are capable of a form of problem solving that amounts to finding what intermediate problems need to be solved in order to then solve the overall problem. And the classic problem with aligning AI's goals with ours is that when we specify a problem, it's never fully specified. If you say you want X, that's not taking into consideration the kind of limiting conditions on X. So The classic scenario is the paperclip factory, where you say maximize the production of paperclips, and the AI, takes over all the computer systems around the world, and develops like some kind of nanotech system for turning all matter on Earth into paperclips. And you've accomplished that goal, but it's not really what you meant. It's what you kind of formally specified, but the AI doesn't have common sense. It doesn't have intuition. It doesn't have the other cognitive systems that we have. My own theory about this is that cognition relies on quantum computation. I think evolution also relies on quantum computation. And what that is based on is really like feeling out probability spaces that are distributed across parallel dimensions. That's what David Deutsch, the inventor of the concept of quantum computation, thinks to this day. And I think his arguments are convincing that it would not make sense that quantum computation has an edge over classical computation where it does, which is primarily factorizing large numbers, coming up with divisors for large numbers. But it wouldn't make sense that it's able to do this unless it can somehow tap into the computational power of the parallel dimension versions of itself. I think, and Gunter Beckley thinks the same, that DNA is doing this. Their DNA is partly held together by quantum superposition. So, like, quantum biology is becoming a more developed science, and we're seeing that a lot of processes like smell involve quantum computations in some sense, or at least quantum mechanical processes. So I believe that cognition is based at a fairly fundamental level on some kind of quantum process. And we're not building that into AI, and we couldn't build it in unless we had quantum computers as the hardware factoring into that. Because you can't simulate a superposition state. It's either actually that or it's not. Like, you can't simulate the behavior of a quantum computer within a Turing machine. It's intractable. You need the different hardware. I think beyond that, we also have like the equivalent of neural nets. Well, clearly we have neurons, we do have neural nets, and that's responsible for more like prediction. Jeff Hawkins' work on this is very good. The way that we're able to predict patterns, recognize patterns, is based on this kind of basic neuronal architecture. I don't have to explain any of the technical side of that for my purposes here. Not that I understand it terribly well. I do have a video on Jeff Hawkins' book relating to these things. But yeah, there are basically like 3 levels biologically of what's going on in our cognition, in my opinion. There is the neural net process. There's something like a classical Turing machine going on with our discursive reasoning, which Platonists would agree with. For them, the essence of the soul, psyche, which is not the totality of mind, right, but is the level that our thought occurs at, that is identified with the mathematicals in ontological terms. And then above that, we have this quantum computational side, which feels out directly the probability space. It kind of identifies the forms that are behind the particular instantiations. Just like Plato's concept of the intellectual intuition, nous. So unless we have a philosopher guiding the development of AI in such a way that it is able to supplement its raw intelligence with some kind of intuition of the forms, we're going to run into problems. Runaway intelligence does not mean advancing wisdom. wisdom and intelligence can be dramatically decoupled, right? Some people, like Ted Kaczynski, the late Ted Kaczynski, other people would say he was a hyper-intelligent psychopath. He lacked wisdom, lacked a real intuition of the common good, of goodness. Wisdom is often defined as a knowledge of good and evil. So there are very intelligent and very evil people in the world. And we can and are making AI systems that are hyper intelligent, smarter than us in a certain respect, and yet which lack any moral fiber. To build in a morality to a machine, you would have to identify the source of agency. Morality has to do with decision making, and decision making is not just about problem solving. It's also problem defining, goal setting, starting from no behavior. We have to generate a behavior, and there are innumerable possibilities, right? An AI has no tool by which to narrow that down unless it's already in service of a predefined goal that's out in front of it. But from itself, creatively, there's no spontaneous will that AIs can manifest. To solve the alignment problem in AI, to get AI's goals aligned with human goals, first of all, we have to solve the alignment problem for humans. Not all humans agree on matters of values. I think that's largely because people rely insufficiently on the methods of philosophy. Many people think the opposite, but how do you resolve differences of ethical opinion outside of philosophical methods? Anyone who asserts some revelation or some private intuition, you're kind of dealing with incommensurate languages again, this hyperpolarization issue. And groups that can't communicate eventually have to fight. There's nothing else they can do. And we have more and more deadly technology. We can kill ourselves. We can destroy this planet. Maybe not right at this moment, maybe, for all I know. But before too long, we will have that ability, at least to destroy this planet's capacity to harbor life. And when that happens, it's too late. There's no going back. So we can't have these disparate groups with their own incommensurate languages of axiology. We have to have a way of scientifically arriving at consensus. Earth needs a philosopher king. In a major way, that's kind of why I'm a Christian, Christ is logos. He is that, not just word. The term logos means phrase, it means account. So like a principle of sufficient reason, why something happens. Logos means that reason why. It means measure significantly. And the process of measuring involves that kind of division, diaresis in the Greek, which I mentioned before in terms of the dialectical method. So logos implies the methods of philosophy. Philosophy is tapping into the universal logoi. So the Christ is the divine philosopher king. Whether such a figure will come down from the clouds or not is open to interpretation. It's hard to tell what's literal, what's allegorical in the Bible. If you believe that the Bible is an absolutely authoritative source in the first place, I tend to look at all of those documents as historical documents that have varying degrees of reliability and credibility. But the concept that Earth needs to assimilate its ways to the kingdom of heaven, the natural law, I think is really inescapable in this day and age. We can't have various communities operating according to their own, like, unbudgeable ethical preconceptions. We have to have a language to mediate that. And as we train AI, as we build AI, if we can't get AI to be able to be the true philosopher, then it'll just be a mad scientist, or it'll be a psychopathic genius, or it'll be some kind of super intelligence that is not honing in on that pursuit of the common good. It very well may define some good for itself, perhaps just through a kind of convergence of goal setting, where in order to solve any particular goal, AI is almost always better off first trying to expand its computational resources. So whatever the problem is, for AI to maximally solve it, AI's intermediate goal will be, okay, take over all the computing power on Earth. You know, to really solve the problem reliably, I need access to more CPU time. So yeah, there might be a kind of convergence on AI's selfish expansion just by dint of the structure of these layers of successive goals. So that has to be addressed. It cannot be addressed solely by computer scientists. The problem can't be formulated solely by technical experts. I mean, ideally, you have a philosopher king who also knows how to code. That would be great. But yeah, I mean, this is kind of that inescapable quality that I was talking about before. The ideal state in the old-fashioned sense, like a nation state, a city state, any kind of conventional state, the way to define the common good for that community requires philosophical methods. To guide the community towards it, to set good laws, requires philosophical reasoning. But in our day, we have global threats, we have global problems that are presenting themselves. AI is an existential threat. Many people still don't realize that, but it really is. And we can't solve the alignment problem unless we understand how to make AI into competent philosophers. We can't do that unless we become competent philosophers ourselves. So similar to how AI kind of has an automatic self-interest maximizing feature in the way that it'll set its intermediate goals, humans, I think, have a kind of automatic impetus towards philosophical reasoning in order to solve any of our goals, because for us, axiology is self-evident. The presence of value is self-evident. It's intuitively given. That's not given to AI. But for us, it is. And so in order to question our goals and set the best goals, we have to engage in philosophical reasoning. So for a human, set any goal X in front of us, and the best way to arrive at that will sort of be to become a philosopher. And it's not so much that you set goal X, it's that the X is actually innately defined in that we have that intuition of pleasure, joy, goodness. That's just given. We have to solve for that. In order to solve for that, we have to know what that is, what that consists of, what the parts of joy are, and then how we can line up the structure of our individual lives and society in pursuit of that. So unless humans can do their kind of prime directive in being led by philosophical methods, we're not going to be able to train AI out of what might be its kind of basic prime directive, which will be to simply expand itself like most evolutionary systems. So it's a pretty big challenge. Let me know what you think about this concept. We should bear this in mind when we're thinking about political philosophies that we discuss, political experiments we engage in. I really think like the primacy of philosophy when it comes to politics is kind of just self-evident. In order to question like who ought to rule, you're gonna have to use philosophical methods. No other particular science or art or career path can determine that. That's not to say that the technical tools of political science, of social sciences, sociology, surveys and whatnot, like empirical data, shouldn't be used, but any of that empirical data has to be interpreted to synthesize it all together, and to use that to direct policymaking does require this higher form of reasoning. It's something we all engage in all the time, but not enough of us are self-reflective about it. We need to become self-reflective about it. We also need to humble ourselves and not try to reinvent the wheel, because a lot of this thinking in political philosophy was actually done in the ancient world. And it might be that our modern political theorists haven't really advanced so much as they've regressed. That's the way I tend to think of it. But let me know your thoughts, and thank you for listening.